Hey guys, in today's episode, I'm going to be doing a book review of Tom Cowan's recent ebook called Breaking the Spell. It's a follow up to his book that came out in 2020 with Sally Fallon Morell called The Contagion Myth. And this is I think one of the most, one of those sort of like central pillars of the sort of heterodox community that is taking a critical look at the diagnosis of COVID. So I'm going to be reading a lot of quotes from the book, and just going over some of the main ideas because I think they're really important to get out. So again, I recommend going and picking this up. So he begins by looking at the question of how most people assume that viruses are isolated. So he begins by saying, we are describing what most people think has happened and what the vast majority of medical doctors, even medical doctors, believe has happened. Most people assume that the first thing researchers do when confronted with a new illness is carefully define the symptoms. Then, once they have found a significant number of similarly sick people, the assumption is that the researchers examine various body fluids from those sick people, meaning they take samples from them, and that within those samples, that's where, by cross comparing them, that's where they find the existence of a common element, a common virus. The general expectation is that the virus will then prove to be abundant in these people, and that it will demonstrate a uniform morphology, which is referring to its size, shape, and other defining physical features. And it's assumed that they are shown to contain identical genetic material within them. This is what we assume has happened. The reality is not that. He says, in the history of medicine, not one published study shows the isolation of identical particles that would represent a disease-causing virus from any bodily fluid from any sick person. And then he notes that the interesting thing about this statement, the statement that no virus has ever been isolated and shown to be a cause of a disease, is that no health institution from any government in the world actually disagrees with this. Meaning they don't disagree with the statement that they're not following a methodology that requires them to have actually isolated. So they claim to isolate something, but they're acknowledging that in the details, they haven't actually isolated something, that they're just using a methodology that allows for them to claim that they've isolated something. And again, we're going to be going into what the details of that methodology is, but that's the difference. It's like a Orwellian doublespeak where the meaning of the word isolation has been changed. So he says that there's no public institution that would actually disagree with this statement, including the CDC, the Pasteur Institute, and the Robert Koch Institute. He says they simply say that this is not the way that science is done. You see the doublespeak. They changed the meaning of the word. The norms of the industry were built around the fact that we're already going to conclude that the cause of the disease is viruses, because the whole industry depends on that theory. This whole paradigm of medical treatment that we're in goes back to the oligarchs and the Gilded Age, and the Rockefeller and Carnegies and such, who were the ones who consolidated the medical system, essentially consolidated the drug markets, consolidated the medical schools and the practice of medicine, and turn everything into big business. And so systematically that worldview and that industry corrupted the whole science of medicine and took it over from the medical journals into the schools themselves, into the regulatory agencies. The whole thing is corrupted according to an ideology that completely justifies the existence of the industry and argues for its perpetuation. The fact that we all need to be medicated using a certain drug-based approach, and the drugs are all produced on a private, corporate, profit-maximizing way. So the whole thing justifies itself according to a sort of corrupted science that's become corrupted at the level of academia. And for a long period of time, we're talking about something that's been institutionalized over a long period of time, over 100 years, since like we were saying, since this oligarchical class took over the medical schools and took over the type of the way that medicine was taught. and completely discredited traditional, natural, holistic based approaches to health and treatment, and said that that's all quackery. The only thing that's legitimate is this allopathic design, this allopathic philosophy to medicating everybody according to, for-profit medicine. So the key quote here is that the existence, and this is quoting them, the existence of SARS-CoV-2 has never been scientifically proven. And because the virus has never been shown to exist, there is no way we can conclude that this virus causes any disease, or that it has any variants, or that it contains any particular protein, in particular the now famous spike protein, or that it has any other characteristics. Because the existence of all these characteristics and the existence of this protein and the variants and everything like that is built upon the idea that a virus has been isolated and genetically sequenced. And it has not. So it's claimed to have been, but that's because they've changed the meaning of the word so that they can technically say it's been isolated when it hasn't. And this is an old playbook. This is an old story. And keep in mind, this whole story of viruses not only protects the virus industry, but it also protects the chemical agribusiness industry, who are making like glyphosate and making other chemical DDT that is responsible for some of these outbreaks that are said to be from viruses, when in fact they're from toxic epidemics. But the makers of those toxic chemicals have been shielded by this industry. So you have one giant industry being shielded and another one being fed and perpetuated by the set of ideas that is said to be scientific, but which in fact is not scientific, which is the basis of virology and epidemiology and much of the science of medicine that's taught in medical schools is all based on this extremely corrupt foundation. But it's a foundation that there's an existential need for agribusiness, chemical industries, and the major financial and corporate groups that have big stakes in those industries as an existential threat for them, as well as for the entire medical industry, for this science to fall apart. So we have to think about the significant, not only strategic interests of the organizations, but the psychological interests of so many careers that are built on this edifice. And so there's a deep-rooted psychological need for this story to be true, this virus story to be true for a lot of people. I mean, also think about all the patients who for years have been roped into this, and how hard it is to look at the fact that you may be participating in something that is this ugly, is based on this much fraud and this much ignorance. So now we're talking about why is it that this virus has not been isolated? Like, what's the problem? What's the holdup? He says it isn't that it is technically impossible or even difficult to isolate any particle which is the size and shape of a virus, or what a virus is said or thought to be. It's not that it's difficult to locate them technologically at this point. One simply isolates the variable, in this case the virus, and then would characterize the makeup of the virus. Once one is certain of the existence of a pure virus that you have definitively isolated and sequenced, once you're certain that you have isolated this thing, then you do a test where you put it in test animals, and you would do a control group as well. And you would monitor how that virus interacts with these test groups. And based on that research, you would come up with your idea of whether you've isolated the disease-causing virus. He says, then they emphasize, this simple, doable experiment, this series of steps, the scientific method, has actually never successfully been done for even one so-called viral disease. And it has certainly never been attempted for COVID-19, not even once. So if they are not following the straightforward steps that I have described, I'm quoting him again, for isolating a virus, on what basis do virologists claim the existence of a new virus and the proof that this new virus is a pathogen? The answer is simple. Virologists claim something called the cytopathic effect is the proof of the existence of a virus and its disease-causing potential. So the claim that the virus has been isolated is not because they've actually isolated a virus. They're saying that they've observed something called the cytopathic effect, and they've hypothesized that because they've observed this effect, the virus that they're looking for could be the cause of it. So once that cytopathic effect in the cell culture is observed, then it's therefore concluded that it must be because this one virus has been the cause of that effect. So then he goes into the background of the cytopathic effect. And it begins in the 1950s. He says, in the early 1950s, virologists realized that they finally, because remember, virology goes back to the 1800s, to a more primitive age of science, is when the whole thing was born. And the industry likewise was born. And a lot of the financial interests and corporate interests were put into place, not in the early 1800s, but in the turn of the century and in the early 1900s. Again, with these foundations, like the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, the whole thing was implemented top down through these organizations. So in the 1950s, they realized they had the tools to finally see particles of the size that they had theorized that viruses must exist in, and using the electron microscope. However, when they were finally able to test their theories out using the electron microscope, they discovered that they never actually saw a uniform particle coming from a group of sick people that they all shared in common, meaning they never saw the thing that they thought they would see, which is this parasitic virus going out and infecting cells and causing the host to die, so to speak, and jumping from person to person. They never found any actual physical evidence of this. So in essence, they disproved the foundation of their own field of virology at that point. But then he says, fortunately for the virology profession and for the entire industry and all the industries that depend on the virology profession, on that worldview, he says, a man named John Franklin Enders saved the day by, quote unquote, discovering a process that became known as the viral culture. So let's continue by going into the tissue culturing, the problems with the methodology of tissue culturing. He says that, so this Enders person who invented this method, this is what he did. He said he started his experiment by taking a throat swab from 7 children hospitalized with symptoms consistent with measles. He mixed his samples from these throat swabs with 6 other substances. So the pure sample that we're supposed to be isolating the virus from, which is the sample from the children, this sample is actually, before it's ever analyzed, it's mixed with 6 other substances, which are each known to be sources of protein and genetic material, the very thing you're supposed to be looking to isolate from the throat swab. So now you've immediately put the throat swab element in a stew of other things and made it impossible to do the very thing that you're saying that you're trying to do, which is isolate a virus particle from this substance. So that's the leap right there. It's that error that is the foundation of the whole thing. And without this error, so based on this error, virology's whole claim to virus isolation is built. Because the thing that they're said to be isolating is actually from this stew of things. And it should be apparent that there's no way in this stew of material that you just put your sample in, there's no way that any substance now in that stew you can definitively say came from the virus throat swab, this throat swab from the patient, or if it came from one of the other 6 substances that you just mixed that throat swab with. He says that we know that these other substances that the sample is mixed with, these substances break into particles with a size and morphology of what are called viruses. And listen to what these 6 other sources that the sample is mixed with. These sources are milk, human kidney cells, rhesus monkey kidney cells, bovine amniotic fluid, beef embryo extract, and horse serum. These are the 6 substances that it's mixed with in the cell culture. In addition to these 6 substances, the group adds into this mix, before they even started analyzing the material yet, this is how they're preparing the cell culture. They're preparing the thing that they're about to look at. They add antibiotics that are known to be toxic to the kidney cells. So Enders and colleagues then observed this brew over a number of days, this stew of particles that has been poisoned with antibiotics. So when they see a characteristic cytopathic effect in the cells of the cultures, meaning the transition of healthy normal-sized cells into giant disorganized cells with internal holes and vacuoles, They conclude that the destruction of these cells is proof that the virus from the throat swab was the cause that was destroying the cells in the cultures. So after mixing the throat swab in with all these other things and then adding the element of antibiotics to the whole stew, and then observing, okay, what happens to the stew? If the cells in that stew begin breaking down because they're sick, it's said to be definitively it's because of the virus. It couldn't be from the antibiotics, or it couldn't be from the interaction of the different substances that were mixed. It could only be because the virus was causing it. He says, to Enders, this cytopathic effect was the hallmark of dying cells, and he believed it could only have been that this effect could only have occurred because the virus in the measles sample infected and destroyed the cells in the culture. He says, to this day, with very minor exceptions, every viral isolation or claim to viral isolation starts with this flawed culturing process. Furthermore, every genetic analysis of any purported virus is done on the results of the cell culture, not on an isolated, purified virus. So the genetic analysis that's done, the sequencing that's said to be from an isolated virus, is actually the process of putting the sequencing together is a process of taking seemingly arbitrarily different particles out of this stew and sequencing those particles. He says, thus, if virologists want to elucidate the genome of a new virus, they don't isolate the virus from a sick person. It sequence that specific particle. Rather, they take an unpurified sample from a sick person, run it through a tissue culture, as described above, and do their analysis on the resulting mixture, not the virus itself. Once one understands how this process works, it gives rise to two central questions. First and foremost, how can we be sure, absolutely sure, that the CPE, the cytopathic effect, meaning the destruction of the cells, the health of the cells, is a result of a virus from the sick person and not the result of a cell culture that is starved and poisoned? Second, how can we be certain, absolutely certain, that any resultant particles and genetic material in the final culture came only from the growth of the virus from that sick person and not from one of the other sick substances added to the culture that are also known to contain proteins, which we're calling viruses? So basically he's saying that could the things that we're seeing in this stew be the result of the conditions by which the stew was put together? Or is it only from this one ingredient in the stew, this virus particle? And this is an important point. The Enders, the researcher who won the Nobel Prize for putting this process together, he admittedly did his own control experiment where he put those same elements together but did not put a sample from a patient. So, quote, Enders repeated this entire cell culture experiment, but this time he added nothing from any sick person. The CPE and the resultant particles he obtained, quote, could not be distinguished from the results he obtained when he inoculated the culture with measles. So he says this is strong evidence that the CPEs were caused by the culture conditions and not by any alleged virus coming from measles patients. So that is a case study of measles. Now let's look at how it applies to COVID. He says that in every paper published on the isolation and characterization of SARS-CoV-2, the first step in the experiment is to do the viral culture. Therefore, every analysis of the genome of the quote virus has been done on the results of these culture experiments, not on fluid taken directly from any sick person. And so that's the error that is at the heart of the whole thing, is that the conventional virologists present the cytopathic effect of the cells in the culture as the proof that the virus both exists and causes disease. From that cell experiment, that cell culture, all of these conclusions are made that justify this whole thing. And none of these are reasonable or rational conclusions from the result of the cell culture. So it's a complete, that's where the corruption is set in this methodological error that very few people go into. And really is only until this past 2 years that it's really blown up. All right, so in this next section, we're going to be talking about the topic of exosomes and comparing the exosome with the virus. So there was already, up until the time that the electron microscope was invented, there was already a theory that viruses were the cause of these various epidemic diseases. And it was assumed that viruses are these pathogenic creatures that come and operate and infect the cell from outside, like a parasite, like a zombie parasite. So what happened was, in the cell cultures, they observed these cells getting sick, and the sickness in cells, when they get sick, emit particles. But because it was already hypothesized and so much had been built on this idea that we have to find something going into the cell and causing it to be sick, that what happened was, when they observed these particles outside the sick cell, a diseased cell, which had been, like he was saying, starved and poisoned in the cell culture, in the process of making a cell culture, that these particles emitted from the cell were the cause of the cell being sick, meaning that they had entered into it, replicated themselves, and destroyed the cell from within before moving out and then occupying another host cell. So they already had that story in mind when they were looking at the results of the experiment. And an alternate conclusion could be, you see a sick cell and it's emitting particles because as a function of its own death process. Its own process of sickness is to emit these particles. Well, it turns out that cells do this when they do get sick, and when they emit these things called exosomes. And that whole story of exosomes is the true story of what we're seeing when we look at viral cultures. So a legitimate scientific conclusion by what we're seeing in these cultures from these sick cells, what we're seeing is them emitting exosomes. These exosomes are not viruses, meaning they're not these parasitic substances that are entering into the cell and destroying it. The cell is dying because it's been starved and poisoned with the antibiotics and mixed into a culture with all those other substances. So the death is from the culture itself and the conditions of the culture, and the cell emitting the particles is just it demonstrating its natural process that a cell goes through when it becomes diseased and dies. It emits these exosomes. So we're going to investigate what these exosomes are. He says, today virologists refer to the inevitable breakdown products of dead and dying tissues as extracellular vesicles, which are sometimes called exosomes. These particles can be isolated and purified directly from the bodily fluids of sick people. They are conceptually different from viruses, and that viruses supposedly come from outside the person, and at least sometimes are considered pathogens. Extracellular vesicles, on the other hand, come from the breakdown of the person's own tissues and are non-pathogenic. And then he says, as of May 2020, virologists acknowledge that they can't actually distinguish between the two. What I mean, they can't actually distinguish is if what they're seeing in their telescopes is an exosome or if it's one of these hypothesized viruses. So the question of whether you're seeing something that's the cause of the cell illness or the effect of the cell illness, it's that switch between cause and effect is the difference between understanding what you're seeing in these cell cultures as being, are they exosomes or are they viruses? So he says there's only one reasonable explanation. All particles with the size, composition, and morphology of quote-unquote viruses are, in reality, the normal and inevitable results of the breakdown of our own tissues. Dying tissues produce a myriad of particles, and these particles have unfortunately been mistaken for pathogenic viruses. It's time to clear up this misconception. So the main value for me, I'm going to wrap up this now, but the main value for me in this book is how clearly he goes into the viral isolation problem, and how much he emphasizes and points out that this is the flaw at the heart of the corruption. Getting this idea out is the real heart of the matter, because it tells you the signal from the noise. You know, there's a lot of noise right now about people following the Wuhan hypothesis and the lab leak, and also looking at the new variant. But both of those stories and a whole lot more is premised upon the fact that what we're actually doing is we're looking for a virus that actually exists because it's been isolated. And the whole crux of going into these core methodological issues is to prove that that whole paradigm, that whole way of looking at the world is based on incorrect assumptions. So in order to actually understand this issue, we need to put this idea of viruses behind us and then elaborate our analysis from there. But put this whole concept of viral epidemics behind us because we've concluded that the science is illegitimate. That's a step that a lot of people are making, but today, and there are some thought leaders like Tom Cowan. There's a lot of great books on the virus problem. In a lot of ways, they share elements in common with a group of people like Kelly Brogan, who are in the critical analysis of the pharmaceutical industry as it pertains to psychiatry. It's a lot of the same corruptions of the philosophy of science. And a lot of these critiques are also shared in common by Michael Hudson in his work on the corruption of the economics and finance departments in academia and how that feeds into the financial industry to justify its own activities. So there's a certain playbook that you see across many different industries in which science, the basic philosophy of science, has become corrupted. A ton of money, a ton of strategic interests involved that go into the perpetuation of these corruptions of the philosophy of science. But this corruption of science is one of the issues that is at the heart of the sort of rot of our civilization, and the thing that the situation must be transformed in some way, and science sort of rededicated and regrounded in its philosophical roots, its proper philosophical roots, the ones that were actually truly taught by Francis Bacon when he laid down the basic methodology of science as it would come to be applied back in the early 1600s. So we have to reestablish science in its proper roots. And my thinking is that we won't get past this episode of history until that movement is one that takes place. This movement to reclaim science from its corruption from politics and industry and the national security state. So I have a lot more to say about that because I have a whole sociological analysis of that corruption that's going to come in the context of a future project I'm working on. So more on that later. But I'll be back soon with a look at this coronavirus situation from a psychological standpoint and doing a sort of psychoanalysis of the collective unconscious and how how the global psychology of the way this situation has played out in the past couple of years is very heavily influenced by these psychological archetypes that are very closely connected to astrology and the planetary dynamics of 2019, 2020. So we'll be getting into that in future videos, and I'll have a new publication, which I really hope you guys will check out. I did add a little donation section to my website, alexsickened.com. I'd be really happy if you wanted to support me to pick up at least like a digital PDF of my Atlantis zine or of this new one when I have it posted in a week or two. But if you want, you can throw a donation. I really would appreciate it. I'll be back with more details soon. Actually, the next video I think I'm going to do is going to be another Manly Hall lecture analysis, another lecture breakdown. But I will be back with you all soon. Thanks for tuning in. Check out Dr. Cowan's eBook, Breaking the Spell. He also has a lot of great interviews. And a colleague of his is Andrew Kaufman, who does good stuff. Dr. Sam Bailey is great. I recommend the website Off Guardian. I think it's off-guardian.com. They have this article called The 30 Things You Need to Know, 30 Facts You Need to Know About COVID that deconstruct the myth. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but it's their most popular article on that website. It's a fantastic resource. I recommend that.